I'm currently working on a text actually related to somatics and psychedelics. And I think that they do, in a sense, similar things. Paying attention to the body, receiving information in that wordless language of our body, and ingesting psychedelics both facilitate this bottom-up processing, which, as we said, isn't as prevalent in modern approaches to healing and therapy. So I'm really excited, both about somatics, also about the potential of psychedelics, because we need not just to try to control our inner experience, but rather to befriend it and to allow what needs to move through us to be felt and attended to.
In this episode of ayahuascapodcast.com, we talk to Joshua Sylvae. We talk about trauma work, how to know if you have trauma, and also how to know if your trauma is healed. We talk about somatic experiencing. What are the similarities between work with ayahuasca and somatic experiencing, and so much more. Hi, guys, and welcome to Ayahuasca Podcast. As always, with you, the host, Sam Believ. Our guest today is Joshua Sylvae. Joshua has been in the field of somatics since 2003. He has MA in clinical psychology, PhD in higher learning and social change. He is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a faculty member at the Somatic Experiencing and Trauma Institute. Joshua, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Joshua, before we begin, tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you into that field of work.
Well, I've been really interested in healing for a good long while now. Started off actually as an activist and was working against environmental devastation. Realized at a certain point that didn't seem like we could talk people into making different choices as regards our relationship with the natural world. And started to realize that trauma, I think, is at the root of a lot of these very destructive practices that modern humans have adopted. Got interested in somatic experiencing as a way of understanding how we as animals might inhibit the release of traumatic stress and create ongoing cycles of dysregulation and a lack of resilience. And have kind of made that my life's purpose for the last couple of decades. I've worked as a psychotherapist and focused on somatic experiencing. I'm now more in the education side, working with professionals who are themselves interested in treating trauma and distress.
That's a very familiar story. You start working with trying to help yourself, and then you eventually start helping others. That's very inspiring. Joshua, for those who don't know, what is somatic experiencing?
Well, the first word somatic is related to the Greek soma, and it just means of the body. And experiencing, of course, is the present tense awareness of our moment-to-moment, here and now process. So what we do in somatic experiencing is really we weave the body into a therapeutic process where we're not just looking at thoughts or emotions, but also at sensations. So getting curious about what the moment-to-moment shifting experience is of being in a body. Oftentimes we gain access to what we might think of as bottom-up information. Much of therapy these days is about top-down control. So you try to engineer a different way of thinking, talk yourself out of different feeling states, and try to domesticate the inner landscape. Somatic experiencing is much more about getting curious in terms of how our nervous system might have imprints that store trauma, that keep us stuck and locked into cycles of dissatisfying fight or flight responses, or the freeze response, the shutdown response.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because we do nowadays spend a lot of time talking and not a lot of time paying attention to the body. And how this looks, the let's say a session of somatic experiencing, how does it look in practice? How do you get people to release stuff from their body?
Often starting off with stabilization. So the first phase of the work is very much dedicated to helping nervous systems to function more in the way that we're designed. A lot of people who have trauma are in cycles of dissociation, where we've withdrawn our attention from the environment, or hypervigilance, where we know there's something wrong and we're desperately trying to figure out what it is. Very, very little orientation, connecting to the environment through the senses. And so one of the first things we'll do often is to invite people back into the practice of becoming aware of the external environment. Then we'll progress on to attending to the whole of our experience. Oftentimes people who have trauma have gotten locked into a focus on what doesn't feel good. So, this obsessive cataloging of my distressing thoughts, my painful emotions, and my uncomfortable sensations. We invite people to also notice the other side of experience, that there's moments of pleasure, moments of comfort, moments of ease, and it's just as important that we attend to those and really dedicate ourselves to feeling those and making sure that we're aware of that as well. That facilitates what Peter Levine, the originator of somatic experiencing, called pendulation, this movement back and forth between what we might think of as positive, i.e., I like it, or negative, i.e., I don't like it, experiences. Once we've kind of established that, supporting people to be able to do activation and deactivation, so they're not just getting stuck in the fight or flight or freeze response. Then we move on to working directly with traumatic imprints. As we do that, we inquire into the body's experience. We see what might be incomplete in different events that a person has not been able to integrate. So sometimes the body wasn't able to complete a motoric response. There was a desire to run away from a situation that we weren't able to complete. There was a desire to fight back against an aggressor that we were overpowered or got too scared to actually be able to do. There was some emotion that was too strong for us, too much, and so we just kind of tried to push it away. We kind of seek out these little pockets of incomplete experience and then try to create a safe environment where people can actually start to move that through. Often as that happens, there will be a discharge of energy. So it seems like the nervous system gets into patterns of maintaining a kind of chronic stress in the nervous system, maybe accompanied by bodily tension. And as we start to move that through, you'll see this quite amazing spontaneous release. Could be in the form of tears, could be in the form of shaking, could be some other kind of process. But it seems to be a part of how bodies release intense survival energy. And Peter Levine, observed this in the animal world. Much of his early work was informed by watching nature videos and seeing how prey animals, when they made their escape, would find a safe place, maybe back within the herd, maybe somewhere far enough away from a predator that they know they're safe, and then they would begin to spontaneously shake and tremble, yawning, so many different things that the body does in this automatic way seem to be really geared towards releasing those energies. And it seems like modern humans block that release in some fashion. And so our work is really dedicated to creating the right kind of environment so that we can move through, find out what's incomplete, let that complete, and then facilitate the discharge, the release of that energy.
That's great. Yeah, I remember hearing about that. I don't remember where, but about the deer when it's hunted, if it runs away, it shakes. So a couple times when I drive and I get into like a near accident situation, which is pretty common here in Colombia where I live, the roads are a little crazy. I remember that and I actually shake a little bit, and I don't know if it helps or not, but I think it's an interesting thing to try. So you talk about the spontaneous release and involuntary body movements, shaking, crying, etc. We observe here at our retreat that sometimes ayahuasca does exactly that. It somehow brings in people that involuntary aspect, and they start to release tension that way. Do you know maybe of a mechanism, or what do you think is happening there when you work with psychedelics?
Well, it appears that many of the classic psychedelics, which many people classify ayahuasca as such, although there's some debate, um, work on serotonergic pathways, specifically targeting certain serotonin receptors. And what many neuroscientists have pointed out is that those serotonergic pathways are largely involved in inhibiting what's called downstream processing. So in the brain, there's always a tremendous amount of stuff going on. We're aware of just the barest sliver of mental processing happening at any given time. And when we take a psychedelic, it seems like it allows us to gain access to what's happening and would be normally below the threshold of our awareness. And so it facilitates that union of body and mind, where the higher brain is able to become aware of the things that are happening, below the surface. Often, as those pathways are opened up, in a similar way, I think, to what happens with somatic experiencing, but also different. You get that same bottom-up effect where our emotional brain, the part of our nervous system that lives in our body, are able to start to speak to us more clearly. We're able to hear them more clearly. And there can be then the accessing of trapped energy and the release of it. So I think, I'm currently working on a text actually related to somatics and psychedelics. And I think that they do, in a sense, similar things. Paying attention to the body, receiving information in that wordless language of our body, and ingesting psychedelics both facilitate this bottom-up processing, which, as we said, isn't as prevalent in modern approaches to healing and therapy. So I'm really excited, both about somatics, also about the potential of psychedelics, because we need not just to try to control our inner experience, but rather to befriend it and to allow what needs to move through us to be felt and attended to.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the word control, because a lot of work that we do here when we prepare people to drink ayahuasca is to teach them how to let go of control and build a certain amount of trust where they can sort of let go of their ego, let go of control, and allow the experience to take charge. So I think it is very similar, as you say, bottom up. Have you ever thought about maybe some interesting way to combine those two modalities? Let's say you use psychedelics to unlock and unblock, and then you use the somatic experiences somatic experiencing to process the trauma quicker. Has there any work been done in that direction?
I don't know about work in any sense of, experimental uh, study, but certainly it's been happening for a long time. In the States, there's the underground psychedelic therapy movement, and in those spaces, I've noticed more of an openness to somatics than I see in the mainstream psychotherapy world. Um, it seems to be recognized by people who are familiar with psychedelic medicines that having a focus on the body is really, really helpful. And a lot of the things that, we're myself and my co-author, Manuela Mishke reads, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about in our book are specifically about that, how useful it is for the guide or therapist to invite the journeyer to notice their bodies, pay attention to what's happening in the body, and incorporate that into their journey.
Can you tell us a little bit about your book? When is it coming out? What do you have the title yet?
Yeah, well, there's a working title. It's Embodied Journeys. Not sure what we'll settle on. And we're contracted to complete the book soon um, with publisher, and hopefully it'll be out by the end of the year.
Okay, so for those who are listening, closer to the end of 2024, check out the book. So in what I've heard from what you talk about, there seems to be this conflict between somatic approach and talk therapy, because one focuses largely on the brain and the thoughts and what's happening up here, and the other about the body. Do you reckon there is some kind of consensus where they could be used together? Or, for example, when we do our ayahuasca retreat, a group talk seems to be very helpful in conjecture with previous release, and people actually open up and they can share more deeply. Sometimes they are even able to uncover trauma and then talk about it. So is there use for talk therapy in your paradigm?
Oh, absolutely. Somatic experiencing is part of the emerging field of somatic psychotherapy. Though SE can be practiced either using dialogue or talk, it can also be done, using touch. But I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I talk to my clients, and though I'm certainly wanting to weave in the sensation that people experience, the technical term is interoception. So, exteroception is when I'm noticing the external environment. Interoception is when I'm feeling sensations in my body. And that's what distinguishes somatic psychotherapy from other approaches to mental health, is that it welcomes in that somatic dimension. But certainly, we want to be able to attend to, I think, all the different layers of experience. Peter Levine in his SE model introduced the idea of SIBAM, that, with our clients, we want to be paying attention to and welcoming in the S of sensation, the I of image, the B of behavior, the A of affect, which is the fancy psychological jargon term for emotion, and then the M of meaning. So we're attending to thoughts, images, emotions, sensations, and then as the practitioner, also noticing postures and gestures and qualities of voice, all of those different things. And my goal is for people to certainly to be aware of the body, to welcome in information from the body, and to do that in a holistic way that also welcomes in the ways that we make meaning, our emotional life, images, spontaneous pictures that show up in the mind's eye. All of that is necessary. We focus on the sensation part, on the somatic part, I think because it's the piece that's most often underrepresented in the experience of modern humans. Many people, I think just by dint of our conditioning, we've kind of forgotten that we have bodies, that we are bodies. And so part of my task as a healer is to help people to more and more get in touch with that part of our reality, and to know that the more that I'm in my somatic experience, the fuller, richer, and more complete my life is going to be. And also the more likely my healing will occur in a full way.
So it's more of a holistic approach. So a lot of people are interested in somatic experiencing for trauma work specifically. If we could talk a little bit about that, how does one know that he has trauma and not just, let's say, something else? How can you? Is there metrics where you can diagnose yourself if you are traumatized?
Well, I never recommend people diagnosing themselves in anything. It's pretty tough, and I think people get themselves into hot water a lot by trying to figure out like what pathology I'm supposed to label myself with. If we're thinking about mental health, psychiatry, the PTSD diagnosis really requires an event. So there's these different criteria to get the PTSD diagnosis. One of them is the A criterion, the very first one you have to meet. And that's that you have to have undergone an event in which, real or threatened death was possible, where there was a sexual violation. It's a very narrow range of very, very intense experiences that would qualify you for a PTSD diagnosis. I generally think that it's more helpful to look at the symptoms. That's what psychiatry does in terms of every other mental health disorder. There's no the term that gets used in the field is the etiology. That's how something comes to be. So the etiology is what precedes and gives rise to the symptoms. Nowhere in psychiatry do they think about the etiology of different disorders. They simply describe the symptoms. And so the psychiatrist meets with their patient and hears about their symptoms and then gives them a diagnosis based on those particular symptoms. And as we know, there's now zillions of different diagnostic categories, to use a technical term. And PTSD is the only one, that has this A criterion, where it's like you have to have experienced this kind of event. It's certainly useful, I think, to be able to tie one's distress to particularly severe kinds of experiences that we've had. But I think trauma is best understood really as nervous system dysregulation. That's where the embodied aspect of our nervous system, the part of our nervous system that communicates with the brain, but also tells our organs and glands what to do, when it gets disordered, it starts to send up alarm bells, and our thinking brain is like, something's wrong. What is it? What's wrong? And we start ruminating and thinking, compulsively about, what's the negative things in our life. It creates these emotional states of, anxiety or depression that make it really difficult to function well. So it's to me, it can be useful to recognize that there's been something in my past that I need to attend to, like a particular event. But I want to know more. What's actually happening? What's showing up in somebody's experience? People can get just as disordered from chronic stress as they can from particular traumatic events. And this is something that I don't think is well understood in the field. That our nervous system is liable, to the same kinds of dysregulation, we could call it, in response to the accumulation of small stressors, challenges not successfully met, as it can from a single very severe event. So, in terms of trauma, our founder again, Peter Levine, he's always said that trauma is in the nervous system, not in the event. Which is pointing towards how, boy, some people can go through really, really terrible stuff, incredibly heinous, events, and be just fine afterwards. I know this from personal experience. Other people might go through what seems from the outside like a relatively mild stressor and completely decompensate afterwards, completely fall apart. I know people who, they got into a little fender bender. No one was hurt, car wasn't even damaged. But then they went home and started to feel more and more and more anxious. Then they would, get into their car and start to stress out. They found themselves not being able to go through that same intersection or parking lot again where they'd had that fender bender. Then the next thing they knew, they were feeling so unsafe behind the wheel that they couldn't drive on the freeway. And then, the next thing they're like, I can't drive at all. I'm just taking public transit. And then, maybe they're not leaving the house, and it can become, this, out of what seems like nothing, a person's entire life is turned upside down. So, I think there's no objective measure of event severity that can really tell us what trauma is or isn't. I think we really want to see, like, what happened that really disorganized a person's life, and is there some way of renegotiating that event that can allow them to function in this fuller way, in the way that we were designed. Well, yeah, I mean, so many people, right afterwards, when they go through stuff, they'll find themselves trembling. And an interesting thing about us modern humans is that we don't seem to like it when our bodies do stuff that we didn't tell it to do. And so there's this trembling that's happening, and a person says to themselves, ooh, this is scary. I'm not making this happen. And that feels very eerie. And they try to shut it down. They try to get back to normal, to a state of control. And I really think that dynamic is what lies behind what we call trauma. And incidentally, for whatever it's worth, I think that's what gets in the way a lot in terms of psychedelic work. The radical alteration in perception, feeling and thinking states that happens under the influence of psychedelics, I think can do a similar thing to people, where it's like, wait, this isn't normal. I'm not doing this. And they freak out. It's hard for us to let go. And yet I think so much of our healing fundamentally depends on that letting go.
Yeah, definitely. I think with psychedelics, it kind of helps people to know that they're in the ceremony and they allow themselves to do more that they normally would. They kind of give themselves permission to have that experience. What you described with people with like a lot of small, relatively insignificant traumatic events, but large amounts of those, it's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. We meet a lot of people like this that sort of seek healing, but they at the same time they feel a bit of like an imposter syndrome. They don't really like to say they have PTSD because it's reserved for veterans and people like first responders. So let's say somebody finds out that they have trauma, they work with it through psychedelics therapy, somatic experiencing. How does one know that the trauma has been resolved?
Yeah, so the thing I look for is the capacity to reflect on the experience and feel appropriate emotions of compassion for myself, to remember how hard that thing was, but not to be thrust into a sense that it's happening right now. The Bessel van der Kolk, the one of the leading lights in traumatology, he said something to the effect of trauma is fundamentally a disorder in the ability to be in the here and now. So when I've experienced, either trauma or maybe this chronic stress, the death by 1,000 cuts, I am continually getting pulled back into the past. My attention gets hijacked, and rather than being present to Sam over here on my screen and this nice conversation that we're having that's inspiring to me, I'm pulled back into some experience from the past. And, I might even start to feel emotions that would be inappropriate for our interaction because my nervous system is now preparing for danger. And so, so much of it, I think, is about being able to land again in the here and now, and to have what I call behavioral flexibility, where I am present to what's happening, and my nervous system supports me to thrive by putting me in the right state for this environment. So I'm not in fight or flight. I'm not in freeze, shut down. I'm able to socially engage because my nervous system is supporting me to be in the right state for that. So as I'm working with clients and, we do some trauma healing work, I will come back in a later session to inquire about how they're holding that event now. And what I want to look for is that they're not totally cut off from it. With some approaches to trauma, you'll hear people say like, yeah, when I think about it, it's just like, I don't know, it's almost like a dream or something. Like I just don't feel anything at all. I don't know that that's actually healing. I think that might be compartmentalization and, altering the neurological framework in one's brain in a way that certainly, is relieving to people because they're not getting triggered all the time. But it may not actually be integrating the experience and facilitating that thing that we call post-traumatic growth, where everything that we go through can improve our lives, can make us, deeper beings. So, I don't necessarily want people who seem just totally cut off from the experience, but I also don't want when somebody thinks about something to be all of a sudden back in that state they were in at the time of that trauma. It's like we want people to have a sense of distance, like, oh, that happened in the past. It's no longer determining my life in the present. So hopefully that makes sense as a way of kind of talking about what I look for in terms of trauma healed.
Mm-hmm. So trauma is trauma response, and let's say our anxiety or depression not being in now, it's something we can't control, right? It happens in the autonomic nervous system. So what are the tools that we have to communicate with our autonomic nervous system? Any sort of tips or tricks for somebody who, let's say, is listening to this podcast now and they feel anxious or depressed?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly the one thing that I often recommend in the beginning is what I described earlier as orientation. So if someone is out there listening and wants to take a moment, looking up from whatever it is that might have captured one's attention and begin to get curious about the external environment. Maybe just for a moment, let your eyes go where they want to go. If you're driving, keep your eyes on the road, but but maybe also notice a little bit, things that you might not have been aware of, colors, shapes, noticing the room that you're in, your environment, and just really starting to get curious about what's out there. A lot of people, as they do this, they'll notice that their body downshifts in a way. There's a spontaneous movement out of arousal and into a kind of settling. There might be a deeper, more spontaneous breath or some other kind of signal that lets us know, like, okay, we're moving into some deactivation now. That is something that I have heard from not a small number of clients, can really change a person's life. Just more regularly taking time to be aware of the environment. We've known since the 50s, actually, Pavlov and all the experiments that were going on there. People had also studied the orienting reflex. That's where we become aware of something new in our environment and something novel, and our gaze spontaneously goes to it. Like if you've ever had the experience of sitting in a cafe and the door opens, a new customer comes in, you can't help but look up from your conversation or the document you're working on your laptop or whatever it is to see, okay, who's that? And, in a big city, it's very unlikely that you're going to know who it is. Like, you don't actually need to be engaging in this looking, but our bodies can't help it. It's like we want to keep tabs on what's going on. We want to know. So, they looked at that orienting reflex and they found that as people did it, their heart rate went down. It's almost as if our organism is designed in a way where when we take time to move our eyes, let our head and neck move, swivel, our body says, "Oh, okay, I'm a little bit safer now." And of course, this makes good sense evolutionarily that as an animal that in the not so distant past, we were not just the, top predator as we are now in our environments. We were also prey. There was danger in our environment before civilization. And, it makes sense that our nervous system would be set up in a way where as I orient to the external environment, I feel safer and thus calmer. So that's a trick for sure. Take some time, notice your environment. Another thing that I strongly recommend to people, and this was also mentioned earlier in the sort of how I might work with a client, take time to register and enjoy positive experiences. A lot of people get really focused on trying to figure out, what's wrong, trying to make sure that I know all the possible pitfalls that are, out there. And, it turns into its own self-reinforcing loop of dysfunction. So, I say it's just so important to take in the good, to really devote ourselves to enjoying those moments of our lives where there is that sense of pleasure, comfort, or ease. So I strongly suggest this to people, not to try to, not because, feeling pleasant stuff is better, but just because it allows us to not get stuck in the negative side. as I'm sure you've seen in your journey work, we need both. We need both the encounter with our own pain and access to resources, the group, the spirit of the medicine, the sense of my own connection with nature. All of those things are so crucial, I think, to the healing process that happens down there. I mean, I'm not there, so don't know for sure, but it's, I think, a fair guess. So it becomes important, I think, that we all remind ourselves and each other how important it is to be in contact with what feels good. That needs to be a part of our lives, and it needs to be a part of our healing process as well. That's the trap of anxiety, right? It's like, I'm anxious, so I try to figure out what's wrong. That makes me more anxious, makes me want to figure out what's wrong more. That makes me more anxious, and it's a vicious circle, as they say.
Thank you, Joshua. That's great information. I can already feel how our listeners are calming down and releasing a bit of their trauma, because you have a very calm and soothing voice, perfect for guided meditations. So, yeah, if you're driving, some of them might be falling asleep. It's very
Don't do it. Let's tell them a joke or something to wake them up.
Yeah. So, you mentioned encountering pain. I think it's very important. Probably in somatic experiencing as much as in the work we do with ayahuasca. A lot of people really want to have pleasant experience, and they want to see beautiful visions. But in reality, most of the work is done when you touch those painful memories and negative feelings, and then you let go of them. You also mentioned breath for a second, because when I think about autonomic nervous system, I automatically think about breath. I think it's one of the easiest things for us to control and be able to calm down ourselves. Do you recommend in your work, do you use any breath work practices?
I really like to make sure that people recognize breath as part of that calming response. I'm a little leery of doing too much breath control, because I can see for a lot of people how that leads into these patterns of inhibiting their nervous system that in the long run aren't as helpful. In the short term, like if somebody comes in and they're experiencing panic attacks, their lives are falling apart because they're stuck in this fight or flight response. Breath practices can be really useful for grounding. But one of the things about SE that's really unique is that we're trying to facilitate this bottom up process. And you used the term earlier. I think it's so important. Involuntary body processes. Really getting people accustomed to and comfortable with the body doing stuff that we're not telling it to do. And my little bit of concern with how popular and prevalent breath practice is becoming, is that it represents this ability to kind of temporarily hijack the autonomic nervous system and shift one variable within that system's function. And that really can, for some people, not for everybody, really can lead to a quick shift into more parasympathetic or more calming in that system. But it doesn't fix the dysregulation. So a person who uses breath to try to downregulate autonomic nervous system function can get relief temporarily, but then they're just going to get stressed again. Then they're just going to get shut down again. And so, I think it's important that we're not just putting a Band-Aid on that, which You might need the Band-Aid in the short term so that the tissue can really heal, but you got to get in there and kind of work with what's underlying that. I will say in psychedelic work, where sometimes things can come up so big, so fast, knowing how to facilitate breath practices that are grounding and supportive, it can make all the difference.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because you only hear good things about breath work and never hear the other side. It's good to also understand that, not to rely on it entirely, and do the introspection to see what's causing the anxiety or panic, as you say. One last thing I want to ask you. You mentioned that we are living in a disembodied culture. Can you talk a little bit about that and tell us, what maybe can we do to be more embodied?
For sure. And I'll just name that in there is an assumption, a sort of cultural assumption. I'm up here in the States, and I think fair to say that folks are mostly disembodied in this culture. I don't know that that's true, in other parts of the world. I know got a couple of friends from Colombia, and they'll report that people are freer in their movements. There can be more dance that happens, more physical touching between people might be more common. So I think all of those things can help us to be in our bodies more. I certainly am not trying to say that every culture is the same or only talk about one culture, but certainly where I live, I think there's a lot of people walking around experiencing themselves as a head that is plopped onto this thing that they're mostly unaware of and just expect to do whatever they tell it to do. I my life, was really transformed by starting to pay more attention to my body, and it started, as different practices I was doing, connecting to nature, and then of course, really somatic experiencing was a big part of that in sessions. I also have been involved in different communities where we did somatic meditation practices, where you take the body as your focus of meditation. I think all of that is supportive for engaging in a practice of self-referencing. So, if my conditioning, if what I experience, like, I'll do this thing. I've now, I do a lot of teaching, sort of traveling around, and I've now asked this question of probably, easily thousands of people at this point all over the world. Did you, when you were a child, have a caregiver who regularly asked you what you were noticing in your body? And as I pose this question to all these thousands of people, I've seen like one or two hands go up over the years. We don't get the training, we don't get the reinforcement that this is relevant. And so, it's I think a skill that needs to be built in life. It's an area where I really try to apply myself to this. And I do that because I find that when I do, it feels better. It's something that I like. And so I pursue it. And so, it could be as simple as just, putting a little alarm on my phone or computer that dings, every so often. And when I hear that ding, I'm like, oh, right, okay. And I might have completely lost track of, the fact that, I have this pulsating, kind of slightly magical seeming organism, that's humming away in the background, keeping me alive and communicating to me all of these feelings of aliveness. Um, and in that moment, I just take time and notice. I find that it can be really helpful. I mentioned taking in the good before, and if I can, as part of that, notice how that pleasant experience is showing up in my body, in the, so we would say NSE, in the sensation channel. I think that's important. So noticing, especially at first, for trauma survivors, noticing good feelings in the body. And, it's a lot of my clients, their body has been a house of pain. It's where they've been violated. It's where they might have a chronic pain syndrome, or they have a functional disorder with their gastrointestinal system. And so attending to their bodies is fraught for them. So I get really excited about people being able to access the body as a source of pleasure, or ease. And then, noticing, like right now, as I was talking, I suddenly became aware that I am running my hand slowly over my knee. And it's like this little self-soothing thing. And like, we're doing this kind of stuff all the time. As a teacher, I get to like just talk a lot and watch people. And I'm just like watching bodies all the time, engaging in these little soothing behaviors, whether it's like rubbing my earlobe or twirling my hair, rubbing the top of my head, stroking my chin, rubbing hands on legs, putting my hands together. Like, there's all of these different things that we're, again, normally totally unconscious of, that I think are the body giving us this message, like, they're there, everything's fine. You can just relax. And so often, as I'm sitting with clients and they're starting to work through stuff, as their system gets stressed, their body will start to soothe itself. And it can be very helpful to become more aware of those things and to recognize that it feels good in our bodies in some way when we do that.
Yeah, that's great to be observant of that. So regarding the question that you said, if somebody asks you growing up, I think I need to start asking my kids that. Definitely gonna introduce this practice. Would be interesting to see how they grow up more conscious about what's happening in their body. So that's a great advice. I really
Nice.
appreciate it. And for you
Yeah,
guys
they
that
may,
sorry, Karen.
oh, sorry, I guess there's a little lag. I was just going to say, they may or may not take you up on it. My kids, when I ask them, like, hey, how does that feel in your body? They're like, Dad, quit trying to be my therapist. They just get annoyed.
Yeah. Well, I'll
May or may
try.
not
I'll
work.
try anyway. I'll try anyway.
Yeah,
And
good. Good.
for those of you who are listening, go be more embodied. Go do some dancing. Go hug somebody. Maybe sing a song. Do
Yeah.
some yoga. Whatever it takes. Be more embodied, guys. Joshua, thank you so much for this episode. I think it was very informative and very entertaining, and also very calming. Joshua, where can people find more about you and your work?
I have a website. It is Sylvae, my last name, which is spelled Sylvae, Sylvae.net. If you want to learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE professional training, you can at traumahealing.org. And then there's Peter Levine's Ergos Institute, which is at somaticexperiencing.com.
Guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our podcast and would like to support us and psychedelic revolution at large, Please follow us and leave a like whenever you're listening to this podcast. Nothing in this podcast is medical advice. It's intended for educational purposes only.
Con la vida, vida te la baila, cura con la guaira, limpia, limpia